He raised killers, but died alone. Welcome back to my channel. Today we will meet a man who created his own mafia and ruled it for years. He also made many enemies during his lifetime. However, when he passed away, no one attended his funeral. There were no friends or family at the hospital when he needed them the most. What happened to him? Let's find out. Joseph Barbera was born in 1892 in the town of Terracine, located in Sicily, Italy. His father was a farmer, and his mother, Giuseppa, worked as a servant. The family had a hard time making ends meet. So when Giuseppe was just 9 years old, his father sent him to live with relatives in the United States. In fact, he wanted to go to America so much that he lied about his age, claiming he was 14, so he could get permission to go to New York. He did well in America, working first as a farmhand and then as a quarry worker. But after a few years, he decided to return to Italy. At this point, he began to notice women, especially one girl named Maria Menco. But there was another young man who liked her, Santo Trafficante, and he was not willing to let her go to another guy. One day, traffic accidents happened near Barbara's house, and he was suspected of causing it. As a result, Barbara was forced to flee to the U.S. once again. It was then that he began his criminal career. He participated in a series of robberies and soon became an important member of the Mafia. At this time, the Mafia had a rather rigid hierarchy. The highest position in the organization was the Capo Mandamento, which meant head of the department. Under him were soldiers, or members, and associates. To rise through the ranks, one had to prove himself by committing crimes. But even if a soldier performed well, becoming a member was still a long shot because of the secrecy of the organization. Only about 10% of associates eventually became full-fledged Mafia members. In 1928, Barbera, along with other criminals from the US and Canada, returned to Italy. This was part of a Mafia plan to expand its drug trafficking business into Europe. Now, Barbera was determined to make a name for himself. He formed an alliance with Michel Navarra, and together they started a profitable bootlegging business. They sold illegal copies of Italian vermouth and wine. These drinks were in very high demand, and the Allies made good money. However, the police soon found out about their activities and arrested them both. This is where the story takes a strange turn. After his arrest, Barbera testified against Navarra in court. It was surprising because Navarra was his ally and friend. But apparently the friendship was not strong enough. And perhaps Barbera realized that in order to move up the career ladder, he had to sacrifice someone. Be that as it may, the betrayal was successful. Navarra was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Don't think that everything turned out great for Barbera. Despite the fact that he helped the police, he still got into big trouble. As soon as the news of the betrayal spread, all the Mafia bosses wanted to kill him. Of course, he expected this reaction, so he had been preparing in advance. Barbera gathered his friends and relatives, and together they fled to a small village in the province of Trapani. At that point, he wasn't afraid of anything. He even bragged that he was ready to die, but would take several enemies with him. The threat was quite serious. If the boss was right, then many people would have to die. But the pursuers didn't dare to touch Barbera for a whole year. Perhaps they thought he had accomplices who would take revenge on them. Or maybe they were scared to do something rash. But at some point, they still decided to attack. As a result, one man was killed, but it was not Barbera. A year later, he left the village and moved to Florence. Soon, he was given the new name Joe Batuta and became a respected Mafia boss. Over the next few years, the man created his own criminal group, La Nuova Mafia, which literally meant the new Mafia. He carefully selected the team and accepted only honest and intelligent people. The guy knew what kind of traitors the Mafia world was full of, so he decided to surround himself with loyal people. His choice fell on ordinary citizens who had nothing to do with crime, but Joe changed everything. He offered them money, power, and fame, which they couldn't refuse. And so the new Mafia was born. Berber's men were much more efficient than the old-school Mafia, because they used modern methods to commit crimes. For example, they used cars to transport illegal goods and weapons. Members of the new Mafia could easily go abroad and even commit crimes in foreign countries. This gave them access to a much larger market. In addition, the guys operated casinos and brothels, which brought in huge profits. So it was no surprise that soon there were rumors in the streets that Joe Batuta was the richest man in Florence. course, the police tried to stop him, but the criminals simply bribed them. In addition, it was difficult to suspect the new Mafia of anything. After all, they led a legitimate lifestyle and only occasionally committed crimes. During the Second World War, Barbara's group suffered heavy losses. Many members went to fight on the front lines and never came back. However, this did not stop the development of the organization. On the contrary, it grew stronger because now the criminals had access to military weapons. So in the post-war years, the group reached its peak. Barbera was already considered the most powerful mafia boss in the country. Over time, his influence began to spread beyond Florence and throughout Italy. But despite the success, the boss always remembered how he betrayed Navarra. Therefore, he strictly forbade his accomplices from testifying against each other. Even if the cops managed to catch a criminal and put pressure on him, he wouldn't give anyone else away. This rule caused problems for the police, but it made Barbara's group even more powerful. By the way, the boss took good care of his reputation and tried to avoid being photographed. There are only 2 pictures of him in which he looks like an elderly gentleman in a suit. But this image didn't correspond to reality. In fact, he looked like a typical gangster. For example, he had a scar on his cheek that he got in a fight. Also, he always wore a gun and only ate foods of Italian origin. In general, Berber was a superstitious person and believed that actions like knocking on wood could bring good luck. But unfortunately, the boss's luck ran out in 1960. That year, he was arrested on drug charges. This was due to the fact that the Americans provided the Italian authorities with a lot of useful information. In particular, they said that the Mafia imported drugs from Turkey and Iran. But they didn't say that the main supplier was actually Barbera. This time, the boss was in serious trouble. He tried to bribe the police, but they weren't interested in any money. In addition, his own men gave him up. They feared that if they didn't do it, they would end up behind bars too. So at the trial, it turned out that not only Barbera was guilty, but also his close associates. Naturally, they all ended up in prison. But it wasn't the worst news. It turned out that the judge who sentenced them had personal ties to the Mafia. He intended to release the criminals soon. But he needed some time to hide the traces of the conspiracy. Unfortunately for Barbara's, he never waited for that moment. While in prison, he developed stomach cancer and died without seeing the light of day. Interestingly, none of his accomplices visited him in the hospital. They were probably afraid that they might be implicated in the case. In the end, the boss died alone. It's hard to say whether the criminals regretted it later. Perhaps they did. After all, everyone needs support in the last moments of their life. But this doesn't change the fact that Barbara's got what he deserved. He was a smart and ambitious man who achieved great success, but he paid for it all with his human qualities. Looking at the boss's life, we can conclude that even in the criminal world, you need to stay human. Do you agree with that? Feel free to write your thoughts in the comments. That's all for today. See you soon. Bye.